Unfortunately, most of those that are being destroyed because of disbelief don't even realize it. And that's our job to take care of that. The authorship is Moses, from Moses. New Testament passages mention that, such as, and it gives an example there of John 3:14 when he said there in the Gospel of John, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, pretty much in the Old and the New Testament, it will say things like, God spoke to Moses. The use of the third person, I found this really interesting, and I hoped a lot of the teachers would be in here this morning, and there are several that are, to help me with this. The use of the third person in writing was a relatively common practice in the ancient world. In other words, if you were to go back to the first chapter and the first verse of the book of Numbers, it says there, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. And it says that several times in the book. It really seems, as simple-minded as I am, if I were writing that, I would put the Lord spoke to me and said thus and so. So I don't know if that was just a writing style of that day, or if maybe Moses was telling this story and somebody else was scribing it down. Do any of y'all have any thoughts on that?
The New Testament writers use the third person as well. And so it's just something that you study the Bible, you kind of have to get used to.
Right. It's different, isn't it? Right. Because it's clear that Moses is the author here, but like I say, in my mind, it sounds like he's telling a story and somebody else maybe is writing it down. No idea. I'm certainly not trying to force that on anybody, but it is different. A different.
I don't think they wanted to take credit for what God was saying.
Maybe so. Maybe so. And that would have been a good way to do that. Like they disassociated themselves as they were doing that writing.
And you know, also, when we were later on, so that people would know who it was, instead of just me, who is me?
Right.
When he identified him as himself
Right.
by name, then we know it's Moses.
Interesting thoughts.
We can say the Lord speaks to Mary Jordan or to James Sutton or to Kenneth Jordan.
Yeah. Yeah. We can through this right here. Number 3, another interesting fact is Leviticus, the book Leviticus that we studied right previous to this, and the book of Deuteronomy that we're going to study right after this. The time frame on those two books was about a month. In other words, the book of Leviticus was written when they were at Sinai, getting ready to make their journey into the wilderness. The book of Deuteronomy is written right at the border of Canaan as they were about to go in. Both of those encapsulate about a month period. The book of Numbers, 40 years. 40 years that they wandered around in that wilderness. 39 it says here in our book. The geographical location from Sinai to Kadesh or Barnea is the first 14 chapters. The wilderness, chapters 15 through 20. I wonder, for instance, there are people in this room, if they were following James around on what was supposed to be in I see a couple of amens back there. Well, he's lost. And I'm sure that's a lot of what the people were saying then. Another interesting thought as far as parallels go, unholiness led to them being lost and wandering around, didn't it? Unholiness leads us to be what? Lost. Different kind of lost. Dan did an excellent Devo one time, Dan Holly, on being lost and how he and I are much the same. I have been every kind of lost you can be. And
Well, James, when you get lost and you don't know where you're at, it's very scary.
it is very scary. It's even scarier than that when you've got two daughters with you that are less than 10 years old and their mama wants to know why it's 2 hours after dark before you get them back. I know all about that. Kadesh to the plain of Moab, chapters 21 through 36. The purpose of Numbers, there at number 5, from a historical perspective, it tells how Israel got to the edge of the promised land and why it took them so long to get there. And then a really interesting thought there to me in part B, doctrinally it shows there are not or no shortcuts to God's blessings. Trust in His promises and persevere. There are no shortcuts to God's blessings. As I thought about that, I don't know why, and I may be way off base here, but Simon the sorcerer from Acts chapter 8 came to my mind. Simon wanted to do what? To receive the power to pass out measures of the Holy Spirit. He wanted to buy it. A shortcut to God's blessing. Not trying to belittle or be high-nosed here, but it's my understanding that there are religious organizations today, if someone passes away, you can buy their way into heaven. There are no shortcuts to God's blessings. If these books that we have studied have taught us nothing else, my takeaway, and I hope yours, is God is very plain in how He likes things to be done, and He accepts no substitutes whatsoever. No substitutes. Nadab and Abihu taught us that for sure. Ma'am?
One of the shortcuts we hear daily on television is just pray that prayer and call that number.
That's exactly right. Send that check. From a Christological standpoint, there are many types of Jesus in the book. John chapter 3, once again, Moses and Jesus and some prophecy in chapter. Let's look at Numbers chapter 24 and read verse 17. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and it will crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Seth. What is he talking about there? Or who's he talking about there? Jesus. Jesus. Does anybody know what the definition of a scepter is? I didn't either, but I read it. It's a symbol of royal authority. A scepter is a symbol of royal authority. Already, once again, talking about Jesus. Okay, is there any question or comments before we get into our survey here on the book of Numbers? All righty. The first is the outline, instruction, the first 10 chapters, order, Chapters 1 through 4, remember we're talking about the book of Numbers is a census of military. And one of the things that I read in there that was interesting to me is that the tribe of Levi, or the Levites, were the what? They were the priests, and they were exempt from the military. Nobody from that served under that was part of the military. The precepts, chapters 5 through chapter 6, talks about from uncleanness and what to do about it. Chapter 6 ends up talking about the Nazirite vow, and I found that very interesting reading as well. Provision, chapters 7 through 9, talked about the offering at the tabernacle, and it ended up there in chapter 9, I believe, something that I wish JCM Industries would read and employ. The Levites began their service at the age of 25 in the priesthood, and at 50 it was time to retire, and I am all about that. Obviously I'm a good little bit on the other side of that, but I think it's still a good idea. I may show it to my boss and see what he thinks. Part D, the pilgrimage, chapters 9 and 10 begins with the Passover being celebrated, and then after that they're talking about leaving Sinai finally. They spent quite some time there at the foot of Mount Sinai, where most commentaries agree that all this was written there at the Mount Sinai. Part 2, insurrection and disorder, chapters 11 through 25, discontentment over provisions. People complained because they worried about where things were going to come from. Disbelief concerning the promises. Let's see. I have a note here about the spies there in chapter 13. Let's read chapter 13, verses 25 through 33, and we'll understand a little bit more about this disbelief. So, if you're familiar with the story at all, they leave Mount Sinai, as we just talked about. They wander and wander and wander and wander in the wilderness, and they end up very close there to the land they had been promised. So they sent some spies into the promised land to check it out, and that this is kind of the story of how that goes. Chapter 13, beginning at verse 25. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of the Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told them, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea along the Jordan." Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once, right now, and occupy it, for we are able to overcome it." Then the men who had gone up with him said, "We're not able to go up against the people, for they're stronger than we." So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have to go to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. And we seemed ourselves to be like grasshoppers, as so we seemed." This is what I promised you. This is where you're going to spend the next generations of your life. The people go in and they'll go, "Oh, we can't do that. It's nice, all right. It's flowing with milk, honey, and it's got great big pretty fruit. But there is some big old rascals that live there. We can't do it. We can't do it." Well, they were probably right. They couldn't do it. But with God, absolutely they could do it. But once again, disbelief, lack of faith, cost them again. After seeing all the miracles that they had already seen, I completely get it.
No telling how many times in the Old Testament he told them that you don't remember what I did for you, you need you.
Right, that's exactly right, Billy. The story of David comes to my mind. You know, when he went up against Goliath. Could David beat up Goliath? Well, no. Could he handle him just fine with God on his side? Well, yeah. Makes me think about things that come up in our lives that cause us to find excuses maybe not to serve as we should. Things that we're up against, problems that we have, and we're thinking just like they thought back then, all wrong. It's not us doing it anyway, it's God. Part 3, intention, reorder there in chapters 26 through 36, talking about the passing of the old generation. Let's look at chapter 20 in verses 10 and 11, kind of help us to understand that. This obviously is the story of Moses and his disobedience. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock and said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand, and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And right back up in front of that, in verse 8, God told him to speak to the rock. Another example, God wanted it done exactly how he wanted it done. Moses, I don't know if it was out of anger, but with him hitting that rock, to me, it was making it look more like he had done something rather than God. Preparing of the new generation, chapters 27 through 36, obedience to the new generation. Then part 2 there in our survey, really a book of 2 generations, and we've already talked about that. The first 14 chapters being the old, the last 21 through 36 being the new. The numbering, old versus new, the journeyings, the instructions. Some of this is impressive to me. The numberings, the primary purpose of this was a military one, and we can read about that on your own. Numbers often referred to as the book of murmurings, a sin that led others and cost them dearly. Just to trivia question, and some of you have been studying this story since you were very, very young. Sin that cost him dearly. Of all of those that left Egypt traveling to Canaan, how many of those, and we're talking about over 1 million people, how many of those made it into Canaan? 2. 2. The old generation didn't make it. Lesson for us, takeaway for James. Don't let disobedience and lack of faith, unrighteousness, unholiness cost us the prize. Don't let it. Y'all cut in anytime you want to. Favorable report of Joshua and Caleb. We just read that story where Caleb, actually one of the spies, quieted the people when they were getting all excited. Oh, you mean they make us look like grasshoppers that we're so big? And Caleb was like, man, it's all right. We can go in and get them right now. Brazen serpent.
Well, these two are showing that there's few that really believe God.
They are.
Just like in the flood, there was just a few that were saved. Just a few got from the Egypt to Canaan land. Just a few believed when the spies went in, and there's just a few today that's gonna be saved.
That is exactly right.
Sad, but that's the way it is.
And most of you were probably able to hear Kenneth, but I guarantee you he and I are on the same page, so I want to kind of clarify that a little bit. Just a few are going to make it. The Bible is very clear in its teaching that the road to the promised land for us is very narrow and very difficult, and very few will find it. I'm not talking about just a few in this room this morning. If you just made a loop from Mount Pleasant down to Shreveport, over to Magnolia, up to Hope, and drew a circle around that, and census the number of people that live in that circle, and then figured out how many of that total number were faithful, it would help you to understand. Most of us don't really grasp it because I think most everybody we know are believers and are faithful. But there are many, 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 thousands upon millions that are not. Just a few. Yes, ma'am.
I think the population here is 1,049.
Right. Yes. That's a great example as well. 1,049 in this little bitty community in the city limits. And then that number represents out of the city limits and in some cases across the river there. So just a few. Once again, helping us to understand how great a task we have. It's our job to increase that few.
James, if you begin thinking about populations and people and that sort of thing, I have a hard time visualizing 1 million people.
Right.
Or like in our country, 300 million people.
Right.
I can't grasp that.
Yeah.
And then you think about the world population, when we're talking 7 billion.
That's right.
It's beyond comprehension. And then you add to that the previous generations, and if the Lord tarries, the future generations. So we're talking numbers here that are hard for us to
Grasp.
visualize.
My point exactly.
What scares me most about this story, James, though, is that was the few out of God's people.
It was. It was.
Talking about us.
Yeah. Unholiness, lack of faith. Let's see here. The brazen serpent story of chapter 21, verses 4 through 9, and then again in John chapter 3, verse 14. I don't know how many of you, most all probably, are familiar with that story. The people got to whining and complaining and groaning and carrying on again. God sent serpents into the camp. The serpents bit the people, and they died. A bunch of them. A bunch of them. God, through Moses, picked up this serpent, called it a brazen serpent, and the people, y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but if they looked on that, they lived. And John chapter 3 and verse 14 there in the New Testament is an interesting thought. Kind of retelling that story again. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. So as that serpent saved them in that time, the Son of Man, represented there, saves us in that time, in this time.
You know, it was their trust in doing what God said that saved them.
That's exactly right.
A lot of people still worship that serpent.
Hey, amen. That's going to come up again. Number 5, from chapters 22 through 24, one of my favorite stories in the Bible is old Balaam and that talking donkey. Love that story. Love that story. I'm probably not going to love it so much if God ever gets old Groovy to talk to me, but it's still a great story. The death of Miriam, Aaron, and the sin of Moses in Numbers chapter 20. Once again, the sin of Moses, we just talked about that, hitting that rock with that stick. First of all, it exemplifies the seriousness of sin. And we read about that in chapter 20, and in chapter 32 it talks about how our sin will find us out. Part B, it expounds the sovereignty of God. Chapters 19 and 23 talks about godliness as opposed to being unclean, and that parallel being godliness as opposed to sin. The surrender of men, chapter 6, beginning in verse 2. I'll read that for you. Going through verse 12. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when either a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to separate himself from the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar made from wine or strong drink, and shall not drink any juice of grapes or eat grapes, fresh or dried. All the days of his separation he shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. Let me look through 23. Is that right? Hang on. 12. And all the days of his vow of separation, no razor will touch his head until the time is completed from which he separates himself to the Lord. He shall be holy. It shall let the locks of his hair, of his head, grow long. And all the days that he separates himself to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body, not even for his father or his mother or his brother or sister. If they die, shall he make himself unclean, because of his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation he is holy to the Lord. And if any man, this is interesting, dies very suddenly beside him, and he defiles his consecrated head, then he shall shave his head on the day of his cleansing. And on the 7th day he will shave it, and on the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the priest shall offer one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, and make atonement for him because he sinned by reason of the dead body. And he shall consecrate his head on that same day, and separate himself to the Lord for the days of his separation, and bring a male lamb a year old for a guilt offering, but the previous period shall be void because of his separation was defiled. Very, very, very meticulous, the surrender of men. Chapter 27, we're getting close to the end of the book, getting close to Moses' death. As we get there, Joshua was chosen then as a successor to Moses. Wilderness being a key word in this reading. The 2 key verses that the author listed were chapters 14 and verse 34, which reads, according to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. So you ever wonder how God come up with that 40 years? There it is. I found that very interesting. Chapter 20 and verse 12. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. Disobedience caused them to fall short. Applications, while it may be necessary to have wilderness in our lives and wilderness experiences, one doesn't have to die there. 2 key sins of Israel: presumption and unbelief in chapters 8, 7 through 12, and the consecration of the Levites and how it applies today. We've talked a lot about atonement and purification and things of that nature. For instance, we just read the Nazirite vow and how if they were made unclean, how they had to get back to a holy state through these different things that they did. What makes us clean today from a spiritual standpoint? Particularly in my mind baptism. Acts 22, verse 16, talking to Paul there, what are you waiting on? Arise and be baptized, washing away your sin. How do we receive atonement? How is Jesus the propitiation of our sin? How do we contact that blood that cleanses us from our sin? We're baptized into Christ. That makes us clean. That makes us holy. And then Revelation teaches, along with a lot of other places, from that point forward, we do our best to live our lives in such a way that makes us appreciative of that sacrifice that was made for us. Numbers 9, and fire to guide the eyes, the trumpets to guide the ear, God's power and man's performance. Number 5, when Israel should have been singing, she was sighing. Does this sound like me? When Israel should have been singing, she was sighing. Does this sound like me? That caused me to do a little thinking. You know, it's easy to read these stories and think, well, how can they do that? How can they whine and complain and question God after all the things that they've seen? It caused me to do a little reflection. I don't know if I've got time to tell this story, but one of the guys that's on our prayer list, Brad Gonzalez, several months ago had a tumor removed from his brain, and he's been taking treatment for that ever since. I was able to take him hunting either Monday night or Tuesday night. It really caused me to think about how much I've got to complain about. It really did. Sometimes we need people like that, I think, to make contact in our lives to understand how blessed we are and how God has taken care of us. This job that I'm whining about because I'm working so many hours has provided for me and my family, sent my kids to college. What do I got to complain about? My foot hurts a little bit. Well, poor me. It was really eye-opening. It really was. It's a grave sin to speak against a true servant of God. Miriam there in Numbers chapter 12, the importance of intercession, chapter 14, 11 through 30. Moses interceded for them, spoke for them. Who intercedes for us? Christ and both in Romans chapter 8, right? Moses interceded for them. Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit intercedes for us. Great thought. Here we go. I wanted us to at least get here. Out of the 603,550 men, aged 20 and above, all but 2 died, Joshua and Caleb. If multiplied by 2 to include the women, we have 1.2 million people. And I don't guess that counts the kids. They was a pile of folks out there, y'all. I never really...
Don't count any of them under 20.
That's exactly right. I mean, what's the population of Houston? Somewhere right around that. Can you imagine taking the population of Houston out in the wilderness for 40 years? The burying the people, the sick people, the on and on and on it goes. It's very amazing to me. Number 9, how many churches are just like Israel? I don't know the answer to that. I would never even touch that. We encourage.
I would say 85 people per day, average dying.
That's exactly right.
Can you imagine how many graves they could?
Right. That's right. All right. Let's just mark it right there. We'll finish that up real quick when we come together next Sunday morning, and then we'll get into Deuteronomy. Old Brant looked like he's up to no good back there. Kent's operation scheduled for Thursday. Ooh.